Something unusual is happening in Canadian politics right now. And if you've been watching Parliament over the past few months, you might have noticed a pattern forming. One by one, MPs from opposition parties are quietly walking across the floor in the House of Commons and joining Mark Carney's Liberal government. First, it was a Conservative, then another, and now, for the first time in this Parliament, an MP from the New Democratic Party has done the exact same thing.
Nunavut MP Lori Idlout has just crossed the floor from the NDP to the Liberals. Now, on its own, that would be a big political story. But when you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, this move is actually part of something bigger that's been unfolding in Ottawa for months.
Because this is now the fourth opposition MP to join Carney's caucus since the last election. 3 Conservatives have already made the switch, and now an NDP MP has followed.
And at the same time, 3 seats in Parliament have become vacant after MPs stepped down or election results were overturned, which means Canadians in those districts will be voting in special elections to choose new representatives.
So when you combine all those defections with those 3 upcoming special elections, suddenly a question that seemed maybe impossible just a few months ago starts to sound a lot more realistic.
Could Mark Carney actually end up with a majority government by summer without Canadians ever going back to the polls?
And for viewers who are outside of Canada, this might sound unusual, but in parliamentary democracies, this kind of thing does happen. Members of Parliament can switch parties, and sometimes that reshapes the balance of power without a national election.
It's one of the quirks of parliamentary systems. Governments are built on seat counts in the legislature. So when MPs move from one party to another, the political math can change overnight.
And that's exactly what may be starting to happen in Canada right now. Because if the numbers break a certain way over the next few months, well, the balance of power in Parliament could shift dramatically. And to understand how that could happen, you have to start with the MPs who have already crossed the floor.
Yeah, when you start seeing multiple MPs from different parties making the same move, that's usually when political observers start asking the deeper question. Because MPs don't make this kind of decision lightly. Crossing the floor is one of the most controversial things a politician can do. It angers former colleagues, it risks backlash from voters, and it can end careers if the public thinks it was done for the wrong reasons.
But it's also not unheard of in Canada either. In fact, political historians estimate it's happened more than 300 times since Confederation in 1867. What makes this moment unusual isn't that it's happening, it's that so many MPs from different parties are doing it at the same time. So when it starts happening repeatedly like this, it usually means something bigger is happening behind the scenes in the political landscape, and we know what that is.
Exactly. And if you look at the timeline, this story actually started several months ago. The first cracks appeared when Conservative MP Chris D'Entremont left his party and joined the Liberal caucus. Then came Michael Maw, another Conservative MP who made the same move. And then not long after that, Edmonton's MP Matt Jeneroux crossed the floor as well, becoming the third Conservative to switch sides. Each of those moves nudged the Liberal seat count to just a little higher. Now, with Lori Idlout joining from the NDP, the government's numbers have moved even closer to that majority territory.
Now, some analysts say that part of the reason MPs may feel comfortable moving toward the Liberals right now is because Carney's government has positioned itself very much in the political center, which makes it easier for politicians from different parties to work with different people.
Which is why Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has reacted so strongly to these defections. He's accused the Liberal government of trying to build a majority through what he calls backroom deals. He's been arguing that Canadians voted for a minority parliament and that those results shouldn't be reshaped through political maneuvering.
Well, the New Democrats are also upset, but for a different reason. Interim leader Don Davies said the party has a long-standing position on floor crossings, that if any MP wants to change parties, the decision should go back to the voters in that riding. That's not how Canada's parliamentary system currently works, right? MPs technically hold their seats as individuals, which means they are allowed to change parties without triggering a by-election. And floor crossings aren't unique in Canada either. Every party has benefited from them at some point.
And that's something that Liberal ministers were quick to point out this week. Dominic LeBlanc reminded reporters that Conservative MPs once stood and applauded when a Liberal MP crossed the floor to join Stephen Harper's government. MPs ultimately represent their ridings, and they can choose where they believe they can best serve those voters. And her reasoning tells us something interesting about where Canadian politics may be heading next.
Yes, in Lori Idlout's case, her explanation for the move focused heavily on issues that are especially important in the North. She talked about Arctic sovereignty, Indigenous rights, and climate change as reasons why she felt working with the government would be more effective than staying in opposition. And those priorities line up closely with some of the areas where Carney's government has been putting significant emphasis, particularly around the Arctic and Canada's geopolitical role in the North.
And that part of the story is actually pretty interesting because the Arctic has quietly become one of the most strategically important regions in the world. With melting sea ice, opening of new shipping routes, and countries like Russia and China showing growing interest in the region, Canada has been under increasing pressure to strengthen its presence there.
And that pressure is growing. From Idlout's perspective, joining the governing party may have felt like a way to have more influence over those decisions. When an MP from Nunavut talks about Arctic sovereignty as a reason for joining the governing party, well, it's not just symbolic politics. It connects directly to Canada's long-term national strategy.
And this is happening at a moment when global politics are shifting quickly everywhere. Countries like Canada are suddenly paying much closer attention to the Arctic security, global trade alliances, and how reliable their partners are going to be in the years ahead.
But I think that the real reason that this story suddenly has people in Ottawa doing political math is because that something else is happening at the same time. Prime Minister Mark Carney has now scheduled 3 upcoming special elections, known in Canada as byelections. And depending on how those races unfold, they could dramatically reshape the balance of power in Parliament.
Yeah, right now the Liberals hold 170 seats in the House of Commons. In the current 343-seat Parliament, a majority government requires 172 seats.
So right now, they're just 2 seats short of a majority. And with 3 special elections scheduled for April 13th, those races will determine whether the government crosses that threshold.
2 of those by-elections are in the Toronto area in ridings that were previously held by cabinet ministers Chrystia Freeland and Bill Blair. Both of those seats have historically been very strong Liberal territory. The third by-election will take place in the Quebec riding of Terrebonne, where the Supreme Court annulled the previous election result after it was disputed in the ballots. What makes this race fascinating is that the Liberals originally won that by just 1 little vote.
Wow, 1 vote, which is the kind of detail that reminds everyone how razor-thin Democratic margins can sometimes be. And if the Liberals were to win 2 of those 3 by-elections, well, suddenly the numbers in the House of Commons start looking very, very different. Win all 3, and the possibility of a narrow Liberal majority becomes a very real possibility.
Although even with that scenario, it comes as a technical complication because the Speaker of the House doesn't normally vote unless there's a tie, and right now the Speaker happens to be a Liberal MP from Quebec. That means even if the Liberals technically reach the number required for a majority, the government might still occasionally need support from opposition MPs to pass legislation, from people not showing up, people being sick, or even some other MPs crossing floors.
So what we're talking about here wouldn't be a comfortable majority government. It would be more like a political tightrope. Just enough seats to control the House most of the time, but still vulnerable to unexpected votes or internal disagreements.
And honestly, there is a strong argument to be made that isn't a bad thing for democracy. A narrow majority or a minority government often forces parties to work together more than they otherwise would.
Exactly. Even if you support the government, and we've said many times, we think Mark Carney is bringing serious leadership right now, every leader does better when they have to answer to Parliament, when policies are debated, challenged, and sometimes improved by the other side.
Yeah, because accountability is part of what makes parliamentary democracies work. When governments have overwhelming majorities, it can be easier for things to move quickly, sure, but it can also mean fewer guardrails.
Yeah, a tight parliament forces at least conversation. And sometimes those conversations produce better policy than one party acting completely on its own. But the reality is, even a narrow majority still changes the balance of power in a very real way.
But even if the numbers don't quite reach majority territory, analysts say that these defections still send a very powerful political perception of momentum. That more politicians may believe the government is gaining strength rather than losing it. And politically, it would still be a huge shift from where things stood after the last election last year.
Yeah, and that raises another interesting question about what's happening inside the opposition parties right now, doesn't it? Losing MPs to another party is never a great sign of internal unity. The Conservatives have now seen 3 MPs leave for the Liberal caucus, and the NDP has lost 1 as well. In the New Democrats' case, that's particularly significant because their caucus was already so small to begin with.
In fact, after Idlout's departure, the NDP holds now just 6 seats in the House of Commons. That is a dramatic drop compared with the influence that they used to hold in previous parliaments. And there's even speculation that another NDP MP, Alexandre Boulance from Montreal, could eventually leave federal politics to run provincially in Quebec.
And if that happens, the NDP's presence in Parliament shrinks even further, which would make it harder for them to play any kind of balance of power role that they've often held in previous minority governments.
So when you step back and look at all these pieces together, floor crossings, upcoming by-elections, and shifting party numbers, it starts to look like the political ground in Ottawa is moving fast.
And there's another factor at play here as well. Polls suggest many Canadians have little appetite for another election right now. With global tensions rising and economic uncertainty growing, a lot of voters seem to want stability more than another campaign.
Now, none of this guarantees a majority government, of course. By-elections are unpredictable, and voters ultimately decide those races. And it's not a lot of voter turnout usually. But if the Liberals do manage to win 2 or 3 of those seats, and if current patterns of defections continues, well, Canada could find itself with a majority government by summer without even holding another national election.
And that would definitely be one of the more unusual political developments in recent Canadian history. Not illegal, not unprecedented, but definitely unusual. It's also a reminder that in parliamentary democracies, political power doesn't only change during elections. Sometimes it shifts quietly between them.
So we're curious with what you think. Are these floor crossings simply individual MPs making personal political choices? Or are we watching the early stages of a larger shift in world politics and Canadian politics?
Yeah, let us know in the comments, because this story is still unfolding and changing, and will continue to do that.
And if you want more analysis like this every day, make sure that you subscribe. Click that bell and check the pinned comment for Substack, Facebook group, and our merch store. Everything is listed in the pinned comment and description below.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.